What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so we are in the second part of our discussion on Dark Knight's Metal, which is kind of crazy. But one of the things I want to do here, before we really jump into this, is I want to talk about the Endless for a second, because this was a debate that started in this video, or in the last video that we did in part one, spilled over into the Green Lantern video, and then I imagine it's probably gonna be back in this one again. I watched a video that Imaginary Axis has on the Endless, and I don't know if you guys have seen it. I'll post a link down in the description. I watch Imaginary Axis all the time. It's one of my favorite channels to check out. But the whole idea of the Endless is that people kind of look at them in weird ways. Take for example the concept of death of the Endless. A lot of people look at death of the Endless and say that is the end-all be-all definitive representation of death, more or less. Death of the Endless is death. And a lot of people usually cite the Sandman series. That's where the Endless originated, and so it makes sense to say whatever the Sandman series says is what's absolutely true, which is not an unreasonable stance to take. If you read Sandman issue number 48, for example, you'll see the statement that the Endless are their embodiments. Dream is the embodiment of dreaming. Death is the embodiment of death, and so on and so forth. But if you go and you read Captain Atom number 42, they'll basically say that's not necessarily true. That you have death of the Endless, and then you have like Black Racer, which represents the death for speedsters, and then you have Necron, who represents death for the Green Lanterns, and they all just are equal. They're just personifications of death. Different people see it different ways. As far as I'm aware, DC's never come out and definitively said, nope, the way that Neil Gaiman explains it is absolutely right. That's the way death works. You have death of the Endless. Everybody else is just an expression of the Endless. It's just a personification of death, is a part of him or something along those lines, and that's it. DC's never done that before. So it's really just kind of whatever you want it to be. When it comes to the concept of Dream of the Endless, I do not believe there is another counterpart to that version in DC Comics. So that creates kind of a weird scenario because there really isn't anybody out there, but it is somewhat of an interesting scenario because it's just one of these circumstances where you have multiple entities representing the same thing, and then DC doesn't really take any steps to consolidate it. But the fact remains, in the last video, we basically left off with the idea that there was this explanation of the Dark Multiverse. There is the main DC multiverse, and then on the backside, there's the Dark Multiverse, but we don't really know anything about it. The only thing we know is that there is a substance called nth metal, and this nth metal is effectively a key that unlocks the door and allows a person to enter the Dark Multiverse, or if a person in possession of nth metal in the Dark Multiverse, it would allow them to enter the positive multiverse, basically the main DC multiverse. And so the idea is that when this whole explanation was happening, Batman did what Batman does. And he stole that little fragment of nth metal and took off. Now again, this kind of makes sense, but keep in mind, this whole story is really in a lot of ways designed to feed into the existing status quo of Bruce Wayne. Batman usually keeps things to himself. He's one of those guys where he basically comes along and says, no one is as smart as me. I'm not cocky about it. I'm not arrogant about it. It's just the way things are. And so with that being the case, I'm the person best suited to pursue this goal and to figure out what it is that's going on. In truth, it's a lack of trust on Batman's behalf towards the other members of the Justice League and everybody who's involved. But keep in mind, we also have things like government agencies who are involved. And Batman knows really better than anybody else that those government agencies can't be trusted. If nth metal is this wildly powerful material that can give people powers, and it fell into the hands of like Amanda Waller of the Suicide Squad, that would be a terrible scenario for almost anybody. And so in Batman's mind, if all this stems back to the idea that there's some sort of untold evil out there that exists outside the multiverse, and nth metal is the key to unlocking it, he's the best person to figure out how it works. And so in the aftermath of Batman stealing this little shard of nth metal, the last shard in existence, and then racing off, it's this massive pursuit by the various members of the Justice League to track him down. And again, this is really kind of interesting here, but it also shows the cunning nature of the Bat family in the sense that you've got everybody hunting for Batman. You've got Superman, you've got Green Arrow, you've got John Constantine and Zatanna, you've got all kinds of characters hunting for Batman. When it comes to the character of Bruce Wayne, he's seen and done it all. This, in conjunction with how intelligent he is, means that there would be almost no way to stop him if he decided he wanted to disappear. And so they're hunting in every conceivable place that Batman would go to. Not only that, because of the fact that this spills out into almost every conceivable facet of the DC universe, they effectively seem to trace Batman down to the Amazon rainforest. And this is cool because you basically got Damian Wayne driving this vehicle and just like talking trash to Wonder Woman. This is why I love Damian Wayne. You know what? rant time. I love Damian Wayne. I don't care if people hate him. Damian Wayne's one of the best characters in the DC universe, and there's no arguing that point. That's just the way it is. He's like this little kid who is one of the best assassins in the world and doesn't take any lip off anybody. And it's amazing. I absolutely love Damian Wayne. But the other half of this is that as they go through and they start tracking down Batman, or at least believe they've tracked down Batman, you've got Aquaman, you've got all these characters popping up out of the woodwork, you've got the Flash chasing him down, only for us to begin finding out these versions of Batman are not Bruce Wayne. And that's why it is that I love Scott Snyder's writing, is because when it's basically revealed that the version of Batman they see is actually Nightwing, it basically goes all the way back to the very opening story of the Court of Owls in Scott Snyder's run, this hologram technology that Dick Grayson uses. But it's the exact same hologram technology he uses when it came to the opening story for Court of Owls when he looked like the Joker. And so with this happening, once they enter into a realm where there's nothing but trees and all these different Batmen are captured, Dick Grayson pulls out a little piece, just this little bitty flower, this little bitty thing that basically has a name that translates into the terrible green beatdown. Everybody panics. Everybody freaks out. Wonder Woman's first response is, oh my God, where are we at? And then, Cyborg responds by, we gotta go. And the reason why is because of the fact that they're in the Parliament of Trees. They're in the realm of Swamp Thing. Now remember, Swamp Thing is one of the more popular characters when it comes to DC Comics, even if in name only. I mean, people know of the name Swamp Thing. They may not know the intricacies of his character, but they do know of the concept. But the largest reinvention of sorts when it came to Swamp Thing actually took place during the run of Alan Moore. He basically established this idea that there had been a litany of Swamp Things before, the Alec Holland version that people were reading at the time. And there was this concept called the Parliament of Trees. Now, the very idea here is that there is basically this giant hive mind, more or less, of plant life across the planet Earth. And the Parliament of Trees selects a person every generation to basically be its protector. And that's what Swamp Thing is. Swamp Thing is a protector of sorts when it comes to the plant life that exists on Earth. The fact remains here, when it comes to Swamp Thing, he is almost this totally indestructible force and largely considered to be one of the most powerful characters that exists out there, in the sense that if you were to destroy the Swamp Thing's physical form, so long as plant life exists on the planet he's on, he can reconstitute himself. Not only that, his strength is pretty extreme, it's pretty intense. He's extremely capable in terms of what he's able to do, and he actually incapacitates the entirety of the Justice League. Not only that, we end up finding out that with Superman kind of being the last man standing, that what ends up taking place here is he deduces where Batman is, in the sense that with everybody disguising themselves as Batman, the real Batman is actually in the back of the truck being driven by Damian Wayne. Now this is one of the coolest parts of the story, because of course Superman swoops in and basically grabs Batman and whisks him off, but we get this really cool explanation in terms of what's going on. And this is why I say Scott Snyder's Batman is so cohesive, because it's this whole run at the beginning of New 52 running all the way up to Endgame, and then a few of the stories afterwards, and then it's basically this tying all of that together. For those of you guys who saw my New 52 run, the videos that we did on Batman, bear with me because there's probably a lot of people who haven't. And if you haven't seen those, I highly suggest you go back and watch them because this ties into everything. What's basically explained here is that there's something that's going to take place called a mantling, or at least it has been taking place. And this all ties back into Final Crisis. During the Final Crisis event, when Batman was hit with the Omega Sanction of Darkseid and he was sent all the way back to the early days of humanity, the character of Barbados first saw him. He first witnessed Bruce Wayne. What ended up happening is that with Barbados basically witnessing Bruce Wayne, what he did is set in motion a series of events that would ultimately culminate in this particular scenario. And so it's basically Barbados playing this game that was designed to span thousands and thousands and thousands of years, basically resulting in this particular situation. But a brunt of the scenarios that took place didn't happen except for within the last few years. The first part was during the events of Court of Owls. During the events of Court of Owls, when Bruce Wayne was trying to figure out who the court was and ultimately learned that the court had existed for eons and was basically turning people who had died into their own personal servants, their own personal assassins, Bruce Wayne was captured by the court and subjected to their labyrinth. In doing so, he had consumed some of the water in order to keep himself from going crazy. This water contained something called electrum. Now we know from the Court of Owls that electrum basically existed alongside dionysium. Dionysium was a substance that could basically give people longevity. It could allow them to live for an extremely long amount of time. Dionysium itself was established as a chemical that existed on Earth and in its most pure form was first met by Vandal Savage, basically an immortal man who consumed Dionysium, making himself immortal. Along the way, Dionysium basically became impure. The Joker eventually encountered it, and so long as the Joker went back and consumed Dionysium, he would always live and he would always recover from his wounds. During the events of Batman Endgame, when Batman was believed to have died at the hands of the Joker, he had basically consumed Dionysium to bring himself back. This ran into Prometheum, which allowed him to return as Batman following the events of the Batman Endgame storyline, and then that ultimately ran into Nth Metal when he exposed himself to it in creating his device that was basically used at the start of the whole Dark Knight's Metal and the casting and the Forge. But the whole idea here is that over the course of the last several years, however many years that may be, Batman has been systematically exposed to these different metals, to 4 particular metals, to Electrum, to Dionysium, to Prometheum, and then eventually to Nth Metal. All these metals have existed in DC Comics over the years. It's DC basically grabbing these materials, adding a couple new ones, and then consolidating them all together and saying they're not just arbitrary metals that exist out there, they are important. And so Batman's biggest concern is that there is a 5th metal, and if he's exposed to it, he will become the doorway. He will become the means by which Barbados and all of his forces will be teleported to the positive multiverse, but Batman doesn't know how to stop it. The problem is that in the middle of this whole thing, Superman punches a hole through Batman. It's crazy. He punches a hole right through him when Wonder Woman shows up and says he's basically just stalling. And that's when we find out this is not Batman. This is Clayface. And that's why I say this is so cool. All these little twists and turns and all these little curves that sort of come out of nowhere, right? You're just like, oh my God, Superman killed Batman. Batman said something to piss him off and Superman just punched a hole in his chest. I mean, that's the initial thought here. And then you find out that it's just Clayface. Now, the reason why is because Superman, distracted in the moment, believing this is Batman, basically just kind of jumped onto it. But remember, Superman memorized Batman's heartbeat. It's one of the kind of things the two of them have in common, in the sense that over the course of DC's publication history, while Superman and Batman have fought each other largely really only after the events of Dark Knight Returns, they had been friends for years and years and years. And while this version of Superman and this version of Batman are basically discovering each other for the first time, the fact remains that they are forming a friendship. And in order to make sure that one of his closest friends is always safe, Superman always knows the heartbeat of Batman. He can always hear it, in the same way he can always hear the heartbeat of Lois Lane and his son Jonathan Kent. And so in this moment, what ends up happening is we basically transition off to Batman once he's actually in the tomb of Khufu, in the Valley of Kings, more or less. Of course, Khufu basically being Hawkman, but the goal of Batman is to grab the mace of Hawkman, grab the mace of Carter Hall, owing to the idea that Barbados had at some point along the line walked the earth. Presumably something happened and he was cast into the Dark Multiverse. We don't know what that event was. We just know that it happened. The rationale of Bruce Wayne here is that if Barbados was basically defeated by the mace of Carter Hall, which presumably is what sent Barbados to the Dark Multiverse, then the idea of Batman is to travel all the way back to the early days when he first arrived in the past during the events of Final Crisis, find Barbados, use the mace, and kill him before all of this can happen. It's the only thing Batman knows to do. This is irrational. It's unreasonable. It's not normally something Batman would do. And what this is designed to do is highlight the desperation of Bruce Wayne. The other half of this is Batman intends to basically jump back into the past using the Omega Sanction of Darkseid. Now again, what this is designed to do is hit back to the events of Darkseid War. Remember, Darkseid War was basically the last Justice League story, and it dealt with the idea of Darkseid going head-to-head with the Anti-Monitor and Darkseid himself dying and then being reborn as a baby, after which he was taken by his daughter Grail. So what this is designed to say is DC hasn't forgotten about that stuff. All that's still in continuity, and we'll probably see all that unfold somewhere along the line. The problem with this is that in the middle of this massive set of events, we end up having this revelation that the Temple of Khufu had long since been destroyed, and they're not actually there. This is all just one giant ruse, and the ruse has been set up by the Court of Owls. This all goes back to the very beginning of Scott Snyder's run, which is why I say you should definitely check out all those videos. When the Court of Owls first popped up in DC Comics, when Scott Snyder first made them, it was basically just this clandestine organization that was just bent on dominating the world and ruling things from behind the scenes, always being in control. What we end up learning here is that somewhere along the line, there was the Parliament of Owls, a group that worshiped birds, and then another group broke off. Another aspect of the Parliament of Owls broke away and started worshiping Barbados. And so in response to this, because of the fact that Barbados had set in motion the idea that Bruce Wayne would eventually be the gateway by which he could enter the main DC universe, the Court of Owls that worship Barbados began setting all these things in motion. They began carrying out the grand plans of Barbados himself. And so they're the ones who have been working behind the scenes. What this means is that everything that's happened in a story that's been written about Batman by Scott Snyder has all served the purpose of the Court of Owls working behind the scenes to make sure that Batman would become the gateway after being exposed to these 5 metals to allow Barbados to enter the positive multiverse. It's a huge revelation. I mean, this is massive in scale. And so ultimately what we learn is this last metal is called Batmanium. Now this is actually kind of cool and it's an interesting name, but the idea of it being called Batmanium is not new. This goes all the way back to Batman number 45 with the New 52. And the way that I understand it, the idea was that there was a woman called Jerry Powers, and she had basically created this collider. And the idea was that there was the periodic table and the metals within it, but the goal of the collider was to basically just start smashing atoms together for the purpose of creating new elements. And where the Court of Owls was aware of what it was that she was doing, they basically let it happen. And the reason why was because inevitably she would basically create Batmanium. She would create this last metal that would be needed in order to basically bring Barbados into the positive multiverse. And so with Batman basically being exposed to Batmanium, all 5 metals have been exposed directly to him. He is now the gateway. And as a result, he's basically teleported away to the Dark Multiverse, and in his place comes Barbados and all of his forces. The whole idea, the whole question that people have is, who's Barbados as a character? What's going on with him? What's he capable of? And why is he here? The sheer power that Barbados possesses is brought to bear when he confronts Superman and Wonder Woman. What he does is touch them. And when he does that, he begins draining the life energy directly out of them. This is an insane level of power. This is a level of power on par with gods. If their power can be drained away in that capacity, what does that say about the Flash? What does it say about the Green Lantern? What does it say about all these other superheroes out there? Do they stand a chance? And that's the question the story is asking once we get to the end. If this guy can show up and take 2 of the most powerful pieces off the chessboard, what hope does anybody else stand? With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like. Man, this story is amazing. And I will catch you all later. Peace.